My husband and I just bought a home. It's in a small town way outside the city, a place with nice, nosy neighbors and big rolling farms. In the summer, there's music in the town square. It's nice. The public schools are good, and most importantly, it's safe. Or that's what we thought. Recently, my husband started misplacing things. A few dollars here and there and a gift card he'd gotten for his birthday. It was frustrating, but not totally unheard of. He does this sometimes. But then, one morning, he went out to his car, and his laptop was missing. So was his camera. Someone had broken in, and now we wondered, that money he lost. Was it really lost? Had someone been rifling through our cars for weeks? And worse, would they come back? Would they move from our cars to our home? Now, listen, we still consider ourselves lucky. We live in a neighborhood where the biggest concern on our minds is petty crime. But when faced with those questions, we had to make a choice. We had to decide how far we should go to keep our family safe. And it got us thinking, how far do you go? Do you invest in a security system, or do you just get the sign? Do you stage a break-in with your family so they know what to do? Do you buy a gun? Maybe you build a wall to keep people out. Then maybe you electrify it and hire guards to shoot on sight. And when you do you put all that extra security on a credit card? How does that debt impact your family's well-being? Or are you really just a jerk to worry about any of this? After all, there are people on the street with nothing. Why is your safety more important than theirs? I think you can probably see where I'm going here. These aren't just the questions we ask about our families and our homes. They're also the questions we ask about our country. How much security is too much security? How much is not enough? What happens when something we thought was true suddenly isn't? And why are we so scared anyway? Could our fear be overblown? This is Things That Go Boom from PRI and Inkstick Media, a podcast about the ins, outs, and what have yous of what keeps us safe. I'm Laicie Healy, and today we'll take a step back to the founding of this country and beyond to ask, what is this thing we call national security? And who does it protect? Turns out, there's no easy answer.
My name is Stephen Knott, and I'm a professor of national security affairs at the United States Naval War College.
You actually teach a class on national security and the Constitution.
I think you can hear how excited I am there. There are tons of experts who work on national security policy. But when we went looking, we realized pretty quickly that there were not so many who could tell us just pretty simply what it is and where it's been. There was a real uptick in thinking about the term national security around World War II. So most folks we asked pointed us there. But we knew that wasn't the whole story, so we were really dying to talk to someone with a background in national security and the Constitution. And that excitement you hear in my voice, that's because we found him.
I'm not sure most Americans understand just how much security concerns dominated the founding of our country. During the Constitutional Convention itself in the summer of 1787, the whole question of the possibility of foreign powers attempting to intervene in our internal affairs was one of the major issues debated during that convention. So the delegates actually spent a considerable amount of time on issues concerning naturalization of immigrants to the United States because the founders were very concerned about the possibility that the European powers would attempt to insert what we would call today a mole or somebody working for a foreign power into the highest reaches of the U.S. government.
That's fascinating. Well, they would be, right? Because they had just had a revolution. They were interested in protecting this new country that they were building.
That's right. These guys, especially people like Washington and Hamilton, had seen death and combat up close and personal, and they were determined to infuse as many elements as they could in this new system that would protect national security.
The founders were also worried about separation of powers. They spent a lot of time defining what the president could and could not do, and Jefferson, in particular, really liked that the Constitution gave Congress the power to declare war. But like a lot of things in the Constitution, Just because the founders were thinking about national security doesn't mean they were prepared for every contingency. Like, say, the end of slavery in America.
They certainly saw not being allowed to expand slavery as a national security threat, literally as a threat to their safety, because they knew black people would continue to resist.
That's Ibram X. Kendi. He's the director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University, and he's the author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And he's talking about the lead up to the Civil War.
And so when, for instance, Southern secessionists, most notably in South Carolina, were sort of politically arousing people to succeed, they were saying things like Haiti. In other words, remember what happened in Haiti, where all of these, the very small white population surrounded by this huge enslaved population, and it led to basically Haitians violently succeeding in a huge slave rebellion for their freedom. That's what Confederates feared if they did not shore up their safety by allowing them to continue to expand black people, which then would have reduced their resistance power.
The Civil War started in 1861, and the Haitian Revolution happened 60 years before that, just after the Constitutional Convention. But it's okay if it doesn't sound familiar, because you probably didn't learn about it in school. The uprising was against the French, against Napoleon, actually. So a lot of American textbooks don't really dwell on its significance to our founding. But the truth is that America as we know it might not exist without Haiti. Here's Stephen.
Believe it or not, the status of the Haitian Revolution and the appropriate position of the United States government towards that revolution was a very divisive issue. Hamilton and the Federalists were very sympathetic to this slave uprising against their French masters in Haiti. And in fact, under President John Adams, who was a Federalist, there were steps taken to recognize this slave republic. The opponents to that recognition were Jefferson and his party, because they feared that that kind of slave uprising that had occurred in Haiti would spread to the United States. So Hamilton even assisted the Haitian revolutionaries in writing their own Republican Constitution. But it was the Jeffersonians, once they came into power in 1800, reversed all of that.
Ironically, the Haitian Revolution and Napoleon's subsequent defeat at the hands of Haiti's freed men enabled Jefferson's purchase of the Louisiana Territory, which expanded both the size of the U.S. itself and the size of the slave trade inside the U.S. The British and ultimately the French, Spanish, and Portuguese began to move away from the international slave trade, convinced of the security threat that it posed. But under Jefferson and America's growing republic of free white men, the U.S. doubled down. But the Haitian Revolution, Louisiana Purchase, and America's subsequent expansion of slavery are only the beginning of the story. By the 1860s, the echoes of Haiti's revolution still remained, and the fears they stoked in Southern slave owners helped lead America into the Civil War. Almost 200 years after that, America is still struggling with the consequences of its actions.
We're closely following the terrible events unfolding in Charlottesville, Virginia.
White supremacy, white nationalism, violence, and death in Charlottesville. The nation watched as uniformed, slogan-shouting white nationalist groups rallied in Emancipation Park near the university founded by Thomas Jefferson and his armed militias.
Often when we think of matters of national security, things that could lead to war, we're focused on external threats. China, Russia, North Korea, maybe immigration or Islamist terrorism. But this isn't that at all. The questions that surround Charlottesville are those of Americans against Americans, and not treasonous spies or would-be defectors. Just the same kind of Americans that got us into the Civil War. And that makes our definition of what and who might constitute a national security threat a lot more confusing.
I don't feel like even though I teach courses dealing with this, I don't feel like I have a good, clear sense of what we mean by national security anymore. It seems to have it's been expanded or inflated beyond all recognition, so that almost any issue that comes down the pike, people try to package it in a sense as a national security question. I'm not belittling people, for instance, who argue that climate change is a national security issue, but that's under the rubric. Any environmental question is now being packaged as a national security issue. In my view, it's unrecognizable. It is so big to the point where I can't give my students, when I teach this stuff, a nice, clear, succinct definition of what we mean by national security.
Just like home security, there isn't an agreed-upon definition for what threatens our safety or what keeps us safe. Because, just like home security, the whole idea is complicated and scary as hell. If you think terrorists are a national security threat, then white nationalists probably are too. Things like climate change and the national debt, it depends on just how much potential you think those things have to be destabilizing. And your opinion on the matter probably depends a lot on your position. In the U.S., we're lucky. We can usually weather both real and proverbial storms. In less fortunate countries across the globe, the effects of climate change can lead to devastating food shortages, migration, and even war. But if, like President Trump, you're skeptical that climate change exists, well then, you're probably going to remove that threat from your national security strategy like he did in December 2017. Perspective, as they say, is everything. Here's Ibram X. Kendi.
Have we historically ever talked about groups like the KKK as terrorists or as a security threat in this way?
Well, black people have, and other groups of people have, but in terms of the media members, for instance, identifying them as terrorists, or even politicians identifying them as terrorists in the way that they were identifying in the last few decades, violent Islamic individuals. No, it's not the case, and they've sought to create a definition of terrorism that somehow excludes these people. You have to, and I think that to me is a huge disservice. For me, a person is a terrorist if they terrorize, period.
He makes it sound so simple there. A person is a terrorist if they terrorize. But in the wake of 9/11 in America, for some reason it still feels provocative to call Dylan Roof, who in the summer of 2015 slaughtered 9 men and women in the middle of Sunday prayer, a terrorist. Based on an investigation of his belongings, Roof had fallen down a rabbit hole of white supremacist internet propaganda. An image from his Facebook page showed him wearing a jacket decorated with the flags of Rhodesia and apartheid-era South Africa. But when asked to comment, James Comey said he didn't see the violence as a political act, which would have been necessary for the FBI to label it an act of terrorism. But later that fall, when Faisal Muhammad stabbed and injured 4 people at the University of California, the FBI deemed it a lone wolf act of terror. They did so based on the extremist websites Muhammad had visited in the days leading up to the attack.
Should we be talking about white nationalists as a security threat?
I think so. And I think, to me, they've always been a security threat in this country. From the security threat that they pose to Native communities, to the security threat they pose to enslaved communities, to the security threat they pose to black communities under Jim Crow, to the security threat they pose now to people who are migrating to this country in the same way they did. They're certainly a security threat. We also have many people who are engaging in mass shootings. Many of those people are white males, and many of those white males are not looked upon as terrorists, or there's no major effort to undermine, basically from a policy standpoint, to take the guns out their hands or even go after the groups or the ideas that are generating their violence. And so that then results in this only continuing to happen.
The idea that someone is a security threat isn't limited to the use of the term terrorist. Traitor is also pretty strong language in today's world. Mass murderer, perpetrator of hate crimes, they're bad too. But not the same. It's not so much the word that matters, but the loaded nature of it. Identifying a person as a threat to not just some of us, but to the nation as a whole, changes the conversation.
When you have so many people who believe that the United States government is effectively, from a policy standpoint, focused on destroying white lives and harming white people. When you have so many people who believe that, and who therefore are joining organizations because of that, and then they simultaneously believe that government is intent on stripping them of their weapons, you have so many people who literally believe that they're guarding against their own livelihood, like that the government, in the way that they believed in 1859, was allied, against them. So too do they believe that now, and I think that creates an extremely dangerous sort of situation, particularly when these people have AR-15s and other extremely deadly weapons, and at any point they can walk into a place and kill 20 people, and there's no effort to strip them of those weapons. And if anything, the powers that be are encouraging them to have those weapons and engalling them good people as they march. I think it's an extremely dangerous moment.
When we think about home security and national security, our thinking depends heavily on our interpretation. And our interpretation depends heavily on our perspective. Say you're a Black family in America, or in the wake of Hurricane Maria, a Puerto Rican family. Does it feel like your neighborhood is quite like the others? Like you have the same chance at safety? And when the government says it's doing something for the sake of national security, does that include protecting you? Sometimes, as it turns out, what we think keeps us safe, or what some of us think keeps us safe, actually harms the rest. Here's another example, a more traditional one. Right now, a lot of us are thinking about North Korea. It's unquestionably one of the biggest security threats on the U.S. horizon. And it's all about nuclear weapons, which, were one to be detonated, even in a test, wouldn't just kill people. It would damage the environment around the blast for years to come. But we don't have to wait for a blast to feel the detrimental impacts of nuclear weapons. Up through the 70s, the U.S. and other countries conducted over 500 nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, essentially blanketing the world with radioactive fallout. In 2002, a study by the CDC and National Cancer Institute found that any person living in the U.S. since 1951 had been exposed. But communities around the uranium mines and test sites needed for the production of nuclear weapons, which, for socioeconomic reasons, are often at a disadvantage already, have an especially acute awareness of the problem. Here's Lovely Umayam, a researcher with the Stimson Center and the editor of the site Bombshell Toe.
It's still very much connected. There's still a relationship there. And really the only people who are attuned to that relationship are the ones who are in the front lines, that are actually have history in their families as miners, or people who work around the nuclear weapons complexes, now the national laboratories, right?
Or live around them, right?
And live around them, yeah, exactly. And so it's quite a difficult conversation to have, because the public typically thinks of mining as mainly for energy now, but when you talk to these people in the front lines that are vulnerable, they don't just see this as energy, but also tied to the legacy of weapons.
The Navajo Nation is just one example, where cancer rates doubled from the 1970s to the 1990s due to the impacts of testing and mining in the southwestern U.S. As recently as 2016, the CDC reported that babies are still being born to Navajo parents with traces of uranium in their urine. While only a handful of active uranium mines remain in the U.S., more than 160,000 have been abandoned, and thousands of those abandoned mines continue to pollute nearby water supplies.
I think a lot of the mining industries would argue that they're a lot safer nowadays. But I think that doesn't really matter for the communities around that area, because they don't really make a distinction between what happened in the past and in the present. Like, this is because they live right there, they're out in their backyards, right? That it's still, they still see the environmental consequences. The historical consequence of not being able to forget what happened to your family, and the fear that it will happen to you.
The fact is that people around U.S. test sites like those in Nevada and the Marshall Islands, mining sites in the western half of the U.S., and the indigenous communities whose lands still house nuclear waste today have been disproportionately affected by the cost of what it takes to keep the rest of us safe.
They would argue that the very existence of nuclear weapons, it's already messed their livelihoods up, right? Like everyone else in the United States is getting protection from something that has already impacted and destroyed their lives. So is that fair? No, I don't know the answer to that.
Albert Einstein once said, "What is right is not always popular, and what is popular is not always right." He famously regretted the role he played in urging the creation of the atomic bomb, but found some justification in the danger that, had he not signed that letter to Roosevelt, the Germans might have made it first. Einstein's recommendations tracked with popular opinion. So did Jefferson's at the time. And it might be fair to say that they should have known, that the death and enslavement of millions of humans should have served as reason enough. But then again, maybe not. After all, what is the death of a burglar when your children's lives are on the line? Often, in the moment, all we can do is depend on what feels right. But often, because interpretations change and perspective isn't always the best resource, what feels right is totally wrong. Things That Go Boom is a podcast about the ins, outs, and what have yous of what keeps us safe, from PRI and Inkstick Media. This episode was produced by Tracy Wall. It was written by me. Our music was composed by Darian Schulman, and Abdullah Rufus was our technical advisor. Thank you to N Square and the Plowshares Fund for supporting this work. On next week's show, a bunch of students try to change the world. And not just change the world, but eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons with design.